Thank you. A recent issue of The Economist, the high priest of neoliberalism, had this to say about Joe Biden's recent economic policy initiatives, particularly three of them. One is the CHIPS Act, the other was the infrastructure spending, and on the green new technologies, which were supposed to uh, give an impetus to make in America. So, the economists found it highly objectionable. Are you are doing, I mean, you are doing industrial policy. How is it? How can you do that? So that's precisely that's I I want to address the question of, basically, we don't have an industrial policy. Neoliberalism doesn't allow for an industrial policy, and I just want to address three specific sectors to highlight why the absence of an industrial policy. An industrial policy requires the state to not just intervene in the markets, but also determine, direct, organize, and make the production ecosystem actually work in specific industries. So, specific industries require specific ecosystems, and these are meant to be organized, and that's what an industrial policy ought to do. And so, I will highlight. They also, in the process, they draw private investment, and in fact, if you look at it, they actually de-risk investment by the private sector. So it should appear logical even for your capitalist class to think this is the good way to do it, but that's not what happens. So I just want to highlight three specific sectors in brief. One, the vaccines, what happened during COVID, and what were the possibilities that was lost. I mean, apart from the fact that so many people died, completely, because we had a callous policy regime which overturned an existing long-standing policy on immunization, and that, but also the fact that you were unable to take hold of the opportunity to develop new vaccines. And so the lack of a state policy to direct and ensure that this happens was badly missed. The second is on chip manufacturing, semiconductor chip manufacturing. There's been much talk about this over the years, and you have had two rounds of, 10 years back, we had one round in which several industrial conglomerates said they would establish capacity, but nothing has come of it. And now you have another round under the production linked incentive scheme. So this, and then I would talk briefly about 5G. I'm not an expert on any of these, but I just want to make some observations which caught my eye. The vaccine production is not a particularly capital intensive operation anywhere in the world. It is not something that requires large volumes of capital, but it's highly complex in the sense that you need an ecosystem to function in a synchronized manner, which involves not just the production facilities of the vaccine manufacturers, but research establishments, your laboratories, your testing equipment, your certification process, so that where the state plays a role in helping through the certification process, because in order to be, to abide with global standards. So all of these are what facilitate a thing. But in what happened in India during we know that Serum Institute of India, as a result of this policy, we were completely dependent on two vaccines, one developed by the Serum Institute of India and the other by Bharat Biotech. And in fact, the Bharat Biotech vaccine was actually developed by a public sector lab, facility. So, in fact, we just handed it over to Bharat Biotech to produce, and they were sitting pretty, and they had no incentive to innovate because you were offering them a monopoly position. So they had absolutely no incentive to do this. So you ended up in a situation where you were completely dependent on two suppliers both of whom were finding it difficult to scale capacities. And on top of that, the entire approach of the Modi administration to the vaccination was that it never actually intended to vaccinate more than 300 million people. If you look at the orders they placed with the vaccine companies, even with Serum Institute and with Bharat Biotech, they never actually intended to vaccinate till the second wave hit. That is when it took some steps to make this possible. But the dependence, the complete dependence on these two vaccines suppliers, and because you offer them I mean, the only way in which the state is acting is to throw money at private enterprise, whether it is the production link system, or in the case of vaccine, it is effectively by offering them a monopoly position, it was effectively throwing money at them. That was the only incentive. There was nothing that the state actually did to enable vaccine production. But the dependence on Serum Institute itself has a backstory in the sense that from 2000, around about middle of the mid 2000s, from say around 2005 6 to particularly in 2008, you completely shut down your entire vaccine producing capacity. You deprive them of funding, you deprive them of all research related activity, and you starved them. And so you were this dependence has a backstory in the sense that you forced yourself into a corner.
Public sector.
Yes. So that's what happened with the case of vaccines. Now, the vaccines themselves, Bharat Biotech's vaccine is the oldest generation of vaccine. There are basically four types of vaccines that have been there: the mRNA, the adenoviral, the inactivated virus. This is the oldest of the oldest vintage, and then you had the protein-based vaccine, which offer, apparently, according to Dr. Satyajit Rath, with whom I have interacted a lot on this, the peptides-based and the protein-based vaccines offer enormous promise. But in all of these, there were Indian companies, Indian small biotech companies, which had some capability. And many of them were incubated by the Department of Biotechnology in the last 25 years. It is not as if they were, they were unknown to the state. But you didn't make any use of them. Some of them actually went into, like, for example, there were small companies which went into the manufacturing Sputnik vaccine and so on. But you did not utilize the capabilities and set up an ecosystem which would have produced these vaccines. So you lost the opportunity to move on to the other generations of vaccines, the later generations of vaccines, which could offer some protection. So there's nothing to say that we have learned, that the state has learned anything from the pandemic to be better prepared for the next time. So that is with vaccines. In chip manufacturing, industrial promotion is basically a means of just throwing money and expecting this will happen. This has not happened the first time. I remember exactly 10 years ago, they said they were going to set up a chain of, they were talking of about 3-4 chip fabs in India. Nothing came of it, though there were several bidders who said that, and all of them, each one of them was completely unconnected to anything to do with electronics. Forget about chip manufacturing. And today, now the production linked incentive system has been extended to chip fabs, and you have an incentives a scheme of 76,000 crores extended to this, and one proposal, we don't know whether it will see the light of day, but Vedanta and Foxconn have proposed to set up a plant in Gujarat costing about 1.5 lakh crores, which means effectively that your entire subsidy is gone. because the subsidy is 50%. So it effectively blocks even a serious contender from entering the race, because your subsidy is gone. So that is now, this is there are some specificities of the chip manufacturing industry. One is that it is highly capital intensive, and in an industry where the product life cycles are very short. And so you have to not only make the chip, but you have to sell it within a time frame and make enough money to make that happen. So that's the nature of the chip industry. Now, but the chip manufacturing process itself also requires an ecosystem to function to make it possible. So you have, in the case of the Indian case where Vedanta and Foxconn, neither of them has the capability to actually make chips. Foxconn is nothing but a contractor. He's a contractor. He has a fab in which he produces chips for somebody else. All those other things that are necessary to make the chip are coming from somewhere else, not from Foxconn. So who's going to build that? All that is necessary to make the chip, including the intellectual property and all of that that goes into the materials, the everything that is necessary for a chip. So nothing is done. Now, I just want to highlight two things about two particular cases. One is from Korea and the other is from Taiwan. I know both of these they have they were very highly specific historical conjunctures which made it possible. There were geopolitics played a role and all of that, but nevertheless, to reduce them to vassal states is not right, I think. I think there was some agency within these states to also develop an indigenous path of their own. So I think, and which has served them in good stead, despite all the other things that may have happened. In the case of, in fact, even in Malaysia and Singapore, there have been, the states have played an important role in setting up this ecosystem. It is not as if they have just invited foreign capital and let them establish these facilities. In Korea, as early as 1957, the Electronics Industry Promotion Law was promulgated, which empowered the Ministry of Commerce and Industry to provide incentives for the electronics industry. Central to this was an 8-year plan, which resulted in the establishment of a dedicated industrial complex. Although initially the Korean companies were making on a contract basis, they quickly moved up because they lacked scale. They established something called the Korean Electronic Industry Cooperative in 1967. This enabled Korean companies to move up the value chain from chip assembly and testing. Because chip assembly and testing was more labor intensive, that is where they got into it to get an initial foothold. But they moved up the value chain, and the Korean state facilitated this process. The next impetus came, ironically, in the wake of the 1971 crisis, in which Korea went to the IMF for a loan. In 74, they introduced another 6-year plan in which the focus was on indigenization in electronics. The earlier thing was to move up the value chain. The second focus was on indigenizing, making sure that they were made in Korea. And the state also facilitated in the acquisition of technology. It not only facilitated access to technology, but it also policed the way in which those technologies were acquired, so that there was no repetition and there was a clear path to moving up the value chain. So that is how the state facilitated this. And in the process, it increased Korea's absorptive capacity, which was thus built without allowing foreign companies to dominate. The other thing they did, unlike in India, which we are seeing with the telecom sector, where the public sector has been sacrificed, in Korea, they use the public telecom companies to bargain to get, in return for access to the market, they insisted on transfer of technology especially with companies like Nortel, AT&T, and so on. So that's the other thing they did. So, and this is what, by this time, by the 80s, I think it was 1986, when there was this fierce war between the US and Japan on electronics industry, and there was in fact, I think I recall a pact between Japan and the US on something on this. This is the opportunity that the Koreans saw to break into the dynamic random access memory market and establish a foothold, which till today they enjoy. I mean, dominance. That is the Korean story. Now, what is the implication of this? What is the significance of the Korean story? I just have an extract from a book, Tiger Technology: The Creation of a Semiconductor Industry in East Asia, by John Matthews and Dong Sung Cho, published about 20 years ago, 22 years ago. To anyone familiar with the Korean development efforts in the 1960s and 70s, the idea of neoclassical economists querying whether the government can make a difference in economic development must seem quaint. In Korea, the government was everything. It set the goals for companies, rationed the finance, disciplined poor performers with financial stringency, and rewarded good performers with financial largesse. It did everything except own and manage the companies. In terms of technological learning, the government vetted all technological licensing and capital equipment import transactions in order to ensure that the best deals were secured and that strategic directions were complied with. Important agencies were established at this time to oversee Korea's rapid development efforts. The Economic Planning Board was established in 1962. This agency and the Bureau of Ministry of Commerce and Industry would henceforth play a critical role in targeting strategic industries and overseeing their performance. The central agency was the Presidential Blue House itself, where a war room was maintained to monitor export performance, and monthly meetings were held with countries' most important chief executives and senior government officials to ensure that the growth targets were met. Investment channeled according to strategic directions and actions taken where targets were missed. So, this is the comprehensive scope of the Korean state's involvement in the chip industry. Now, Taiwan is a little different in the sense that in Taiwan, the state played an even more important interventionist role, that it was directly involved in actually establishing. In the Korean case, it more or less facilitated the process for investment by private companies. In the case of Taiwan, they actually entered into public private partnerships to make this happen, and they also established a large network of labs, research facilities, and a collaboration with the universities. And this is what resulted in the TSMC emerging as the world's biggest semiconductor chip manufacturing company. So that's the Taiwanese thing. So the point is that neither of this has anything to do with the neoliberal imagination. I mean, there is absolutely nothing that that is common to this and a neoliberal vision. So there is, if you need to do this, you need to have an industrial policy. That's what it means. Now, in the about 5G, I you see, the 5G is basically it is not just more of the same in terms of uh, mobile telephony technologies, in the sense that it is a quantum leap. It is not about ensuring that you can download your Netflix movie quicker or something like that. It is not actually even meant for individual users to experience. I went to the Huawei's R&D facility just before the pandemic. I was lucky, and there it was obvious that 5G is something that it operates at scale, and it's actually a basket of technologies. It is not one thing. It is it's something very different in the sense that you're talking about scale and low latency at the same time. So you mean mission critical applications? You're talking about transportation. You're talking about road traffic networks. You're talking about airline networks. You're talking about shipping. You're talking about container movements. You're talking about that kind of scale. So this is not about, and where the Indian companies, both Jio and Bharti, the two companies that are there, which are primarily operating these services, are actually mis-selling this product, because this is not meant for you and me. What they are trying to do instead is to increase the increase the tariff by mis-selling a product which is not even going to work at what they claim it to be. In fact, what Bharti is going to use is a non-standalone network, which is basically it is overlaid on an existing 4G network, which is not true blue, I mean 5G. So you're not getting access to the technology, you're doing nothing about it, nor have you, in the meantime, you have squandered an opportunity to bargain hard with suppliers, because you have sold out on BSNL and MTNL, your state agencies, the telecom companies who could have given you some leverage to access technology. There's nothing, so you have nothing at all. So you basically, you don't have a policy to make sure that you become more self-reliant. You have a pathway to attain it, and you can develop further from there. That's my point. Thank you.